great to see such a full room. I'm Giovanna Treverani, I'm the faculty director of SETA, and it's a great pleasure to see so many of you today. It's the last Tuesday talk of the quarter, and a very distinguished speaker and visitor that I will invite my colleague Rowan Dover to introduce right now. But before I do, pass the project to Rowan, I will introduce the speaker today, Joe Guldi. I want to let you know also that Joe has been here since yesterday. It's one of the many times she's been a SETA, and there's always, whenever she comes, it's full of energy and energizing conversations. And we had some yesterday critical data packages, and then we had some more this modeling, but also now. And then at 4 p.m., Joe is giving another talk here for British Studies about entitled The Long War, the Global Struggle for Occupancy Rights. So we know that there is more of Joe even today that you can go and benefit from. But now I let my colleague Rowan in the department introducing Joe.
What an honor, what a joy it is for me to introduce today's speaker, who joins us from Dallas, where she's Associate Professor of History and Associate Professor of Data Science at Southern Methodist University, having previously taught at Brown and Chicago, interrupted by a stint at Harvard's Junior Society of Fellows. Her scholarly interests are both expansive and interconnected. Her work on the global history of land reforms deepens her engagement with the climate crisis. Her digital humanities scholarship democratizes history as she investigates the history of democracy, and her trailblazing use of text mining charts possible futures while illuminating invisible pasts. She is, by any measure, one of the most creative historians of our time, but the word that I would most associate with her work is critical. From the much discussed History Manifesto that she co-authored with David Armitage to her forthcoming book on the dangerous art of text mining, she's repeatedly challenged humanists of all stripes, and especially her fellow historian, to reckon with the shortcoming and short-sightedness of our disciplines. Critical too, in a sense of skilled analysis and exacting judgment, as emerges from the interplay of archival sleuthing and historiographical excavation that characterizes her books on 19th century British infrastructure and the global struggle for occupancy rights. And critical finally in a sense of urgent and essential, for in talk after talk, article after article, book after book, in podcasts and blog posts and digital projects, she reminds us of the challenges that we face as academics, as citizens, as humans, and then maps out the paths by which we might overcome them. A longtime friend of SETA should be speaking today about validating quantitative findings about history. Please join me in welcoming my fellow, admired colleague and dear friend, Joe Guldi.
And thank you, Giovanna. Thank you to all of you for coming. It's so heartwarming to be back in a place where I always learn so much. I was confessing to Giovanna that for every trip to SETA the next 3 years, I can fake being on the cutting edge of any region in the digital humanities because of the interactions and the conversations that I have, usually in this room. So this is a wonderful homecoming, and it's such a pleasure. I'm technically full professor. I don't think I've updated all of my bio. Thank you very much. At 4 p.m., I'm talking about the book that came out last year. It came out in May of 2023, The Long Land War. If you like archival things, global engagement, post-colonial revolutionaries, and property rights, please come back. I won't talk about any of that right now. Right now, I will be in the realm totally of text mining and methods. And also there's no text mining in this book. If everything goes according to plan, in approximately 3 books from now, the 2 pillars will converge. And you can read about text mining property, which I've been doing all along, but I'm building up that arch slowly. If you want to read about that process, there's a blog entry to be published later this month at the Royal Historical Society. So there is no doubt that social science today is becoming a big data discipline. As part of that process, the fields make new discoveries. In political science, economics, and sociology, investigations into robustness, inductive versus deductive thinking, correlation and causality, and false positives have generated important new standards for the validation of truth. Now, because history is both a social science subject as well as a humanities discipline, history has an appreciation for quantitative description as well as qualitative description. And our processes of individual historians, therefore, look very different. Temporal experience as a criterion of successful discovery is slightly different than the criteria proposed on the basis of certainty as a whole in other social science fields. But because we're ultimately a positive science descended from the Enlightenment, we in history take an interest in specific findings about events, periodization, and other temporal experiences contained within our textual work archive. And here I believe could be the beginning of a productive dialogue across the social sciences about best practices for characterizing temporal change over time and validating conclusions made on the basis of algorithms. In today's talk, I'd like to talk to you about what validation means when applying text mining to the analysis of past events. And I'll be introducing three historical concepts: memory, periodization, and archives. I'll be telling you about applying statistics and machine learning to mass digitalized corpora in order to gain insight about these three categories of temporal experience. But first, I need to tell you a little bit about what text mining is, how validation is designing how validation is traditionally performed in history, and why I recommend working with standards of meaning for the field of history when engaging in text mining. Mining refers specifically to the extraction of valuable metallic ores from the earth, and metaphorically to any process that extracts rare and valuable content from its surrounding context. Data mining begins with counting, but includes statistical transformations to test for relationships such as correlation and significance. Text mining typically treats text as data. It begins with computational transformations that break up and classify digitalized strings of archival text into units representing constituent words and phrases, next applying statistical manipulations in order to study meaningful signals and relationships, typically of the kind that trained analysts from the humanities and social sciences would like to detect in the course of reading, which is now carried out over a larger scale. Validating the results of quantitative text mining represents a new terrain that requires thinking with the tools of multiple disciplines. In history, as with other fields in the humanities, problems of believability have traditionally been linked to forms of dense qualitative descriptions of unique objects. So consider, for example, this surveyor's notebook from Ireland in the 1880s, which includes notes on local farmsteads, the cost of rent, and economic investment, easy enough to translate into a spreadsheet, but also elements more difficult to discern when abstracted in data. The shape of this book is about yay big, which means it was constructed by a woman-owned paper maker shop in Dublin for the purposes of being fit into the coat pocket of a surveyor traveling by train from farmstead to farmstead. And it's by reading the invisible context of the data, not the data itself, that the historian learns about the surveyor's politics and how his beliefs about designing a participatory economy factored into the development of a new method of surveying the landscape, and therefore collecting information about rents in order to figure out when tenants were being overtaxed. Relevant details are located in the object or the biography, not the words on the paper, not the numbers in the fields. Those might be relevant to another project, but what I was principally drawn to was the surrounding context of this notebook. So it follows that text mining only ever applies to a sliver of the available knowledge from archives about the past. Text mining, the methods that I'm going to talk about, offers no replacement for the much larger body of knowledge, which is history as a whole, a field that's potentially concerned with the life of surveyors as well as the agrarian rebellions and political movements with which they intersected. So the surveyor's notebook also illustrates a kind of expertise the kinds of expertise that have traditionally been necessary to manufacture a compelling interpretation of the past. The reader's willingness to trust qualitative descriptions hinges on forms of expertise such as paleography, rhetoric, the history of technology, or the history of the book. A deep training in specialized skills supports the individual historian's appreciation of specific details that support meaningful interpretation. The practitioners from the field of history are likely to demand similarly high levels of detail and engagement from this new approach of text mining. They want to test the bias of each data set, the limits, as well as the promise of each algorithm, as well as the results of what happens when the algorithm is applied. Above all, they expect some reckoning with meaning, with significant stories that have not previously been heard, yet which harness the potential of shaking up our understanding about the past, adding fundamentally new information to our stories about nations, institutions, individuals, and human experience in general. Discussions of accuracy and meaningfulness are vital to text mining because the tools of text mining are by their nature reductive. They produce meaning by taking a knife to the data of the past, reducing past experience to some minimized selection of information. So each data-driven visualization produced by text mining is merely one possible representation of what Timothy Tingerlini and Peter Leonard called the vast unread behind data analysis. Every exercise in data mining works with a portion of possible truths housed in the totality of the historical archive, such that any given interpretation of data necessarily represents massive information loss. Yet text mining is powerful if done right. If analyses of text mining are visualized successfully, the resulting tiny image offers at least potentially an outsized return on investment, distilling shelf miles of text into a valuable, pithy representation of what all those words meant. So a single visualization might reduce the story of a single institution's politics and how they've changed over 100 years, or it might give us a mirror of what stories people have told about how COVID was transmitted, or how American novelists present white characters and Black characters differently, and how those changed over time. But there are also many data-driven analyses of text that purport to offer substantive insight and fail. Such failures of text mining occur when algorithmic distillations of text are misapplied, with the result of analyses that are empty, biased, or simply false. Failing to account for the limits and bias of archives is the major reason for many of the retractions to articles in Science and the papers of the National Academy of Science today, many of which have been attacked by historians. For example, this representation of the history of the world associated with an article in the journal Science, it's circulated on a Nature website, which failed to represent in its mass depiction of global migration any activity by non-whites as part of world history. A second problem frequently encountered is failing to account for grammatical relationships in representations of language through bags of word models, which can be corrected, for example, in this chart by Tingerlini, by taking the verbs and the grammatical relationship seriously. Indeed, a third problem is failing to engage with existing knowledge about the past, which results in data-driven text mining as simply redundant. For example, in the publications by the Culturomics group associated with Google Ngrams, whose conclusions included the existence of censorship in Nazi Germany. In a qualitative question, like the determination of relevant historical events, validation is more than a matter of p-values and error bars. A validation practice that is satisfying to both historians and theorists of information must demonstrate intimacy with algorithms and their parameters, as well as a technical interest in the results of those algorithms applied to historical questions. It must depict temporal experience in a way recognizable to historians with a capacity for innovation in what we already know about the past. The former criteria require an appreciation of statistics, the latter of history. So in metallurgy, the field that understands the geography and physiognomy of veins of ore is geology. In historical experience, the field that understands meaning and its historical value are in the humanities and social sciences, and in history in particular. We have already established that appreciation of the bias of each archive is a requirement of robust analysis. So allow me to introduce my data. My data is the debates of the House of Commons and House of Lords, the UK Parliament, commonly known as as Hansard, in reference to the publisher Thomas Curzon Hansard, who collected transcriptions or reports of the speech, more like memory at the beginning of the century, more like transcription by shorthand at the end of the century. Here's Parliament. Up in the gallery, you would find stenographers, journalists writing down as many words as they can of the speeches that they deem appropriate. Fewer of them at the beginning of the century, more at the end. There's definitely a bias built in. You don't see women in this depiction. It is a biased institution. The women are way up in the attic in the ladies' gallery, looking down, taking notes, discussing many of the debates, sometimes with their husbands or brothers, at the end of the day. So the words are not a representation in any way of modern life in Britain in its totality. This is an elite institution. It's merely a segment of the population. It's certain words in an institution that has particular words about representation for political acts. And yet, it is big data. It's particular marked text that is useful for the practice of telling relatively long duration stories about time. My data is 1806 to 1911. It's big data. There are 46,000 individual speakers, 112 separate debates, 1 million speeches, and about 250 million words. It's too much to read. We also have established that the discipline of history guides the analyses of texts from the past that are meaningful, that is capable of precision and insight. In my forthcoming book, The Dangerous Art of Text Mining, I argue for beginning with the building blocks of historical understanding. And I give the list that I show here of the fundamental concepts that I think the philosophy of history has formulated over the last century that offer the basis for a more critical data science of text grounded in an understanding and appreciation of historical change. Most of the book consists of pairing tools from statistics and machine learning, with each of these historical concepts in turn, in order to ask, what can text mining tell us about memory? What can text mining tell us about events in the Houses of Parliament, or about periodization, or about the limits of the archive? So I'm not trying to answer the question of history as a whole. I take for granted that there will be multiple representations of history. And I believe that by bringing into dialogue the concepts from the philosophy of history of how historians understand temporal experience with data science, it becomes possible to advance towards a newly robust practice of digital history. And digital history then has something to contribute to a smarter data science. And in this book, I set off by making the case for a smarter data science grounded in the humanities. You cannot trust the results of GPT, GPT-3 to summarize historical truth. But what if we develop a text mining practice that is, in fact, trustworthy? It's a massive contribution towards a trustworthy AI and to the status of knowledge in today's data-driven society. So in this talk, I'm prepared to show approaches of the 3 categories I mentioned here: memory, periodization, and archive. If time remains, I will use it to join these cases studies to one of my theoretical publications on critical search, which lays out a validation process for working between qualitative questions and quantitative answers. So let's begin with the problem of memory. Memory as a concept in historical studies. Introduced by Maurice Eldwachs at the beginning of the 20th century, memory is distinct from history, the study of what actually happened in the past. Memory is a collective anchored to place and oral tradition. It is a source of identity. History is institutional and expert, bound up with Enlightenment dialectics of argumentation. Memory studies trace the popular, partial, and often deeply political reception of the past, in contrast to the study of history proper, which applies social science to pursue the truth of the totality of past experience. So historians have canonically studied memory through the creation of new rituals and monuments, whether Tudor funerary monuments like this one created to instruct the public about the political accomplishments of Richard Boyle or Earl of Cork, or the monuments of Civil War generals, or the invention of the Scottish kilt. In what follows, I'm concerned with acts of memorialization in speech that can be counted in the transcriptions of the parliamentary speeches. So let's begin with a simple search for numbers between 1066 and 1911 in the parliamentary debates that were mentioned more than 20 times in a given year. The numbers could, of course, refer to anything, so there's an opportunity for false positives, page numbers, rates of taxation, conversion to the metric system. But the strong diagonal line suggests that the numbers are meaningful because people in Parliament tend to refer to legislation in their own year, the previous year, or the immediate following year. And occasionally to legal deadlines expected in the future, like 1870, a deadline for a legal review. Spot checking the numbers annotated in the graph confirms that they are also references to years. The visual form of the chart is a modest innovation in visualization. I adopted a double dot plot to represent what I call a double timeline for understanding these dynamics. Time is on the x-axis, and time is also on the y-axis. On the x-axis, we have the year of mention, the year in which a speech was delivered. On the y-axis, we have the year that is mentioned. So we're looking at speeches in 1850 that refer to years from the Tudor past or the Stuart past. If some years are, and it lends itself to some starter observations. If some years are being added while others are dropping off every year, we would expect a steady upward diagonal. And that's part of what we find. But we also see some strong verticals that here I'll try not to trip over my cord. So around 1838, there's a strong vertical line, which suggests a moment of performative reference to the past. And this is the date of the formation of the new Conservative Party associated with Benjamin Disraeli and the Tamworth Manifesto. And if you go and look up all of these references, they seem very random indeed. There are references to the date of the formation of the Earldom of Mar. There are dates to official legislation about Tudor vestments, church vestments, what priests are supposed to wear on different occasions. And taken one at a time, they seem totally random. But organized in the timeline, this vertical strongly suggests a pattern of performative reference as members of the Conservative Party are signaling to each other and to the nation that they are the representatives of some lost national past, some lost national identity. In the past, they know about the dates of funerary vestments. They know about the Earldom of Mar. Success with this method indeed confirms that the method is indeed capable of identifying changing relationships to memory, which would have otherwise been entirely invisible via traditional methods. But part of my reasoning about the validation of historical findings via methods like this is the importance of iteration. So in each of the examples that I show you, I'm going to iterate in a kind of exploratory data analysis from one quantitative approach to others. So we can ask the memory question, again, with the help of named entity recognition and the Spacey software package, looking for mentions of historical events over time. Again, a double timeline. On the y-axis are the events mentioned by name. We're literally counting the words for the Kaffir War or the American Constitution. On the x-axis, the date of mention. And here, different patterns emerge, what's important about iterating over these methods is that they don't all tell the same story. The vertical timeline of 1838 and conservative formation was the most visible fruit of the first exercise. The second exercise tells us about very different patterns. It tells us that the Crimean War and the plan of campaign, the struggle for Irish freedom from landlordism, were the two of the most memorialized events after the French Revolution, which is the single longest trail of memory in 19th century consciousness. Not really surprising to students of British history, the fear of the French Revolution has long been an interpretive mechanism for understanding coercion in 19th century Britain. But even though we knew that, we didn't know it in the same way. We didn't know it quantitatively. We also haven't reflected on the memory of the plan of campaign or the Crimea in contrast to other events. We also see some evidence for the relative evanescence of colonial wars, even of the Great Exhibition, not entirely anticipated. That the Persian War, Egyptian War, and Boer War should fade from memory in a way that the Crimean War and French Revolution don't, is some matter for further reflection. So this again gives us some information. When I showed this slide at Emory, an American historian explained, so 1832 is the first date, the date of the first Great Reform Act, when the middle class gets the vote, is the first time in Parliament that the British mentioned the American Constitution. And indeed, that's a worthy discovery of note. So they're weighing pro and con as the American Constitution evidence that if we expand the vote, that Britain will be a more stable nation. Nowhere discussed in the literature, but the double timeline makes it easy to find correlations of that kind. But this approach likewise has its bias. There's next to no mention of social events, cultural events, working class events, minus the Great Exhibition, or the plan of campaign, unless we are liable to miss them unless we explicitly go looking for them. So if we control the vocabulary again, looking for a named entity recognition, but some level of control, we can center on the events of social and colonial history that seized Parliament's imagination. Here, the scale of examination is smaller by a factor of 10. We're looking at events that would have shown up in the previous visualization, but they were mentioned much less at a smaller rate. So this is one of the purposes of exploratory data visualization, is to get us deeper into the data, not allowing scale of mention to be the one criterion for interest. We're also legitimately interested in what Parliament says about working class events and colonial events, even though it's a biased institution. So again, we allow Spacey to generate the names of variations. We find these events are spoken about to a degree less. And this visualization allows us to compare the persistence of memory of the Irish famine and the Bengal famine. So consider the Irish famine talked about nearly every year, a great deal after 1830. The Bengal famine, with millions dead. It said, it's my annotation that it's 1770, but of course there's a contemporary Bengal famine going on in 1880. It mentioned and then barely remembered 10 years later, fades almost instantly from memory. So we might predict that, but again, we didn't know in the same way the evanescence of memory. Again, we might predict that the Great Revolt, the so-called mutiny of India would be a big deal. Indian historians have long looked to the memory of the way the British talk about the Great Revolt as a threat to masculinity and to empire as a significant event, but we see it in a different way visualized as it becomes abundantly clear that every reference to India has to be accompanied in Parliament by a reference to the Great Revolt. The fear is kept alive. So we have a metric for comparing these events and references, the persistence of memory that we did not previously have. Now, if we control the vocabulary once more, we might ask, where is the working class? Where is the working class in Britain? We can go looking for bigrams that mention riots. Here, the scale again diminishes by a factor of 10. The max number in the previous visualization was 989, and here the first visualization, the maximum number was 989. The second visualization was 77. Here, the maximum number of mentions per year is 6. So we're diminishing the scale again. Riots are a matter dealt with by Parliament hastily when they arise and quickly forgotten. Although we find that the lasting memory of the Gordon riots of 1780 and the Featherstone riots bear looking into. Here we get a really specific time frame of the question for investigation. Most remembered of early riots are the Rebecca riots and the Gordon riots. But why is it that the Hyde Park riot of 1866 seems to invoke comparisons with the Gordon riots of 1780, whereas the Wexford riot of 1883 and later riots, those comparisons essentially vanish? Why does the obsolescence of memory tell us about, what does this obsolescence of memory tell us about how contemporary events are being interpreted? So in distinction to the previous charts of events, here's a fundamentally new question about the vanishing of memory, one that couldn't have been asked before text mining. Had a student a decade ago had a question about the role of memory in political debates about riots, they might have used keyword search to plumb two questions to any two riots at the same time, but they would have been limited by close reading in the number of riots they could compare. They could not have begun with an archive and an entire category of temporal experience, like memory itself, and progressed from there to identify riots as a subject where the patterns of memory are full of surprises. So what intrigues me here is that scale, in this case, a more general vocabulary of event-like phrases or a more specific vocabulary of bigrams, becomes a generative tool for peering into hidden layers in the past. As I explained in my introduction, any visualization represents information loss. But for digital historians trying to see something new in the past, the takeaway is the importance of looking at the same problem at different levels of scale. The first visualization with name entity recognition is not necessarily the most instructive. Insight in text mining often comes by drilling down from the general to the more specific question, moving from aggregate events to imperial and to social history. In the second case study, I'd like to describe applying an algorithm to the process of finding statistical distinctiveness, TF-IDF, and applying this algorithm to the problem of periodization. So this is a presentation of an article that was published several months ago in American Historical Review under the title Algorithm, which I love because the AHR made it sound like it's the only article that the AHR will ever publish about algorithms, and I have defined the algorithm, and that is all you ever need to know. That's probably not true, but let's just pretend for a moment. In contrast to memory, periodization is a theory about how time is divided. Historians argue about the significance of centuries and decades, posing questions like, when did the 19th century begin? 1789 is a good candidate. We are interested in what distinguishes one decade from another or one century from another, and the possibility that some periods were more consequential for later generations than others. I'm going to be using the algorithm TF-IDF, which is a vintage statistical algorithm familiar to students of library science. TF-IDF was introduced in 1973 by a statistician Karen Spark Jones, a tool for classifying articles by ranking the likelihood of each word document pair relative to all other words in all documents in a data set. The way it works in brief is that if Mark Algie Hewitt has written an article about carving runestones with bananas, and nobody else here has written about runestones or bananas, you've all written many articles, but not about bananas and not about runestones. Then runestones and bananas are very highly associated with Mark Algie Hewitt. Yeah, so it's a distinctiveness algorithm. It asks, did everybody else talk about bananas? No. Did you talk about runestones? No. In my article, I apply this algorithm not to find the keywords most associated with individual articles in the library, which is how it was first introduced. But I perform a very modest alteration. Instead of asking how distinctive is each word of each author or each article, I asked how distinctive is each word of each period of time? And what is a period of time? Well, a period of time could be 20 years, could be 10 years, could be a year, it could be a week or a day. So I asked all of those questions. What are the words most distinctive of 20-year period? What are the words most distinctive of individual days? Again, I'm iterating through the process of how the algorithm is applied, using scale as a method for trying to understand how the algorithm produces different perspectives on the temporal experience of the past. Here are the results. At the level of the 20-year period, we get fairly predictable results that look something like a table of contents for a textbook on British history. In the 1800s, we get references to the Corn Laws and their effect in the time of harvest failure, the Bank of England and cash payments, the repeal of the Corn Laws. Later we get the repeal of the Corn Laws and Irish famine, cholera and the temperance movement, rent strikes and the Crofters Rebellion, working men's compensation and public education. None of these things is surprising to British history, and in a way that's nice, because what this proves is that the technique could be applied to accurately periodize new corpora. For example, if we wanted to understand what has happened on Reddit over the last 15 years, and we don't have a big theory about what the changing periodizations are of the last 15 years. We know that it produced familiar results from British history. It would probably work on something else. When we iterate through different levels of the past, we find that the smaller the time period, the more likely the distinctive words are to relate to the concerns of the working class. So here we're looking at a visualization of the words that are most distinctive of one day, meaning that that word was spoken on one day and one day alone, perhaps a lot, but just on one day out of a year, a century, a 20-year period. It's a very distinctive measure. It may be that then the distinctiveness measure has some slack in it. It could be that plumbers are mentioned at other times in Parliament, but they are most distinctive of this period around 1905. One day. It turns out to be the day in which the plumbers union presents its case to the British Parliament. At the level of one day, the concerns of the working class turn up. The concerns of brewers and distilleries, concern with vagrants, of silk workers, and environmental concerns like smoke control. So one thing that's interesting about this is that we start to understand that in Parliament, time operates as an index of parliamentary attention. The plumbers only get one day because they're a working class interest, and they can't command the political agenda setting power to inspire a debate over the rights of plumbers for an entire week. At the level of a week, we're more likely to get civic concerns. At the level of things debated over a month, we get concerns like the abolition of slavery or the regulation of the railway system. So you see a hierarchy of political attention and how that attention is spent over the century, moving from paviors to vagrants to ale houses to the concerns of beer houses and plumbers. Now, distinctiveness can also be calculated via different approaches. So if we again change the way that the algorithm is applied, we can, in the previous examples, we're looking at something that I call temporal fossils, words that are spoken about intensively for just one period. Just for the 1840s, we talk about the Irish famine. Just for one day, we talk about concerns of plumbers. But we can also tweak how the algorithm is applied to find historical novelty, which is words that have never been spoken about before the 1850s or the 1880s. And the results of this process look very different. We can find short, absolute historical novelty, short-term trends, and last gasps, or those words whose usage is disappearing for every period of time. And here again, we get different perspectives on temporal change and what an event means or what characterizes a particular period. So what I'm proposing is this, that one form of validation in a qualitative discipline like history is simply carefully looking at the results of minor adjustments and how an algorithm is applied. So for potential categories of analysis, like temporal fossils, absolute historical novelties, short-term trends, and last gasps, together reflect ideas about the shape of temporal experience, what is temporally distinctive. And each of these interventions creates the possibility of many complementary objects of study. In the third case study, I'd like to submit some recent work on the archive. In history, the archive is key. Our findings are only as good as our ability to muster a record of specific documentary instance that proves an argument. And one of the challenges of working with big data is to tack between distant and close reading. Find one of these signals over the long term, but then to relate it back to specific mentions in an archive. That is to move from the aggregate visualizations like the ones I've been showing back to specific speech acts recorded in the archives with names, dates, verifiable records about exactly what happened. So the method I'm about to present will apply word embeddings, another model, to questions of historical processes, navigating all the way back. And so here I'm actually going to, oh, sorry, that's my script. Show you the data in detail. The method that I'm applying in this section, word embeddings, offers several possible elements of interest to a student of historical thought. Word embeddings can be used to detect many kinds of historical forces, but one of their best versions is accurately demonstrating the changing context in which a single keyword is presented. So if you look with me at table one shows you the data from the congressional record, the transcript of speeches in the US Congress. And in this case, we're looking from 1970 to 2010, 1970 being the first time that the word environmentalist appears in Congress. This is a study of the changing context in which the word environmentalist appears. The word to vec algorithm applies a limited grammatical analysis with a limited distinctiveness algorithm to suggest the words that are most likely to appear as the columns working within the same sentence or paragraph in a speech in which environmentalists are mentioned. One of the first things that we see is that the context of environmentalism changes over time. The context in which environmentalists are referred to. And by the way, I choose the word environmentalist rather than environmental or environment because it's less ambiguous. Word endings matter in this kind of analysis. When we refer to an environment, we could be talking about childhood learning environments or toxic work environment, not necessarily the environment as in the Dover School. So environmentalist gives us a specific access to the valence in which environmental activism is being discussed in Congress. So in 12.1, the word embeddings suggest many possible directions that we could think about how the discussions in Congress are changing. You might note the names of changing industries invoked alongside these debates, or geographical regions, or historical figures, or endangered species, which come in and out of the perspective. It's up to the analyst to decide which of these words are most salient for later investigation. And most of those words I'm leaving on the table. I decided to become interested in just one subset of table one, and that is the words which seem to have a moral valence. And my interest in words with a moral valence, moralizing term, comes because of reading Oreskes and Conway's engagement with questions of how Congress is tilted away from the scientific consensus that climate change is real and urgent. So I decided to focus on this moral discourse. Oreskes and Conway, in their accounts, they argue that the discovery of the climate emergency in the 1960s was met with urgencies from the scientific community for federal attention and sustained research. By the 1980s, however, a handful of rogue scientists with close ties to the fossil fuel industry began to deliberately influence the analysis of climate change using doctored graphics and bringing defamation lawsuits against the scientists who tried to argue with them. So Oreskes and Conway are naming names not in the US Congress so much as in the world of journalism. They're waging one kind of litigative history in which specific acts and specific names are very deeply important. So to back that up with a digital history analog, my question was how far text mining could help us to specify a similarly litigative form of analysis against certain figures in the US Congress. How was the game tilted against environmentalism in Congress? In table 2.2, I show you the results of going through the word embedding table in the first table by hand. So the only difference between 12.1 and 12.2 is that I've hand selected certain words. Here, 12.1, I'm just giving you the top, is it 37? The top 30 odd politics of the word environmentalist, but that table is actually much, much longer. It is as long as the number of unique words in the corpus. I read the first 500 rows. Reading the first 500 rows, I found many moralizing terms, and here are the ones that I found. They include words such as kook, zealot, howl, crazy, selfish, extremism, death knell, unconcerned, naysayer, outcry, etc. Strongly moralizing word. Language of dealing with environmental debates over environmentalism. Now, the word embeddings don't tell us how these words are being used. We guess, we ultimately don't know whether indeed it's the environmentalist who's being called a kook, or my environmentalist friend said that the anti-environmentalists were kook, the oil interests are full of kooks. We don't know. We just have an index of how much more language is in the discourse as a whole. So we're going to need to iterate again in order to understand this changing period of discourse. But already we have some interesting clues from table 12.2 about what's happening. In that there's a shape to this table, is there not? There are two moments, at least when people are moralizing a lot more than other moments. You see them? So again, it's the top 500 words. It's an imperfect method, but it's some rule of thumb. So at this point, I shifted to word counts to track the bigrams where moralizing words were being paired in a two-word phrase with environmentalist. And here the historical pattern becomes clear. We see something like a moralizing rhetoric escalating from 20 mentions a year up to 80 mentions of the phrase in 2005 to 2009. And the findings suggest that a new rhetoric of moralizing coincides with something that happens in the 1990s. Perhaps, again, we could guess that this might be associated with the strategy of Republican strategist Fred Luntz and the famous 1990 memo, Language, a Key Mechanism of Control, which Julian Salazar tells us was distributed by Newt Gingrich to all members of the Republican caucus in Congress in 1990. But we can go further. Next, I investigated which speakers used these phrases, the phrases like extreme environmentalist or wealthy environmentalist for the previous visualization. And it turns out that 90% of those two-word attacks on environmentalists came from only 6 speakers in Congress. The chart suggests that well before Gingrich, Alaska Senator Ted Stevens was already pioneering a rhetoric of mistrust. So the remaining visualizations that I've given you, the data is what we call keywords in context, and it's so simple it's barely data science. We're just excerpting the places, the speeches, the exact speeches by Ted Stevens, where the term extreme environmentalist appeared in the 1970s with the date of the speech. So here's the evidence. Let's see. Reading through Ted Stevens' speeches suggests that he coined the phrase extreme environmentalist to sow mistrust against the defenders of Alaskan wildlife when advocating for the Trans-Alaska Pipeline from 1973 to the 1990s, when he amplified his storytelling about his previous tactics in order to support the Gingrich campaign. In 2001, Stevens swapped the phrase extreme environmentalist to the phrase radical environmentalist in the aftermath of 9/11, making the case for seeing acts that sort of continuing with terrorism. So by using computational approaches alongside conceptual questions, which is the historian's problem of explanation, the analyst can leverage the scalar power of the algorithm against questions that will matter like this one. Such an approach requires a commitment to the textual database, the US Congress, and a series of methods. The most important of which is explanation. It's the historical question of why this data matters. Hence, departing from the work of Naomi Oreskes for the relevant question, why did Congress not respond to the science of climate change? Word embeddings, word counts, and guided reading are stops along the way, providing answers for questions that already exist in the world. The text mining can support this work of historical explanation and also make it incredibly efficient to find those passages where the individual phrases are pulled from and to reason about the use of invocation of a certain rhetorical style. The historical explanation itself combines the evidence of word embedding with an understanding of an appreciation for historical context and grand questions of explaining historical change, none of which come from the computer. Regarding text mining as an art that requires a sense of what matters, engaging context and questions from the humanities and social science produces a very different research project from those data science papers and those computer science papers, which are concerned solely with algorithmic innovation and proving the usefulness of one algorithm at a time. So I will just give the briefest summary because we are almost at the top of the hour. Thank you for staying with me. The briefest summary is that I have written a lot about a theory of critical search. Critical search is a theory of alternating between qualitative analysis and quantitative analysis, or problems like the theory that I've shown you. The concepts of historical understanding of temporal experience, memory and archive and periodization don't come from computer science. They come from my discipline of history. The understanding of how to apply them, the textual understanding of what Disraeli was up to in 1838, or what Newt Gingrich was up to in 1990, similarly comes from secondary sources. So I've suggested that the best way to proceed through any digital history project is through alternating between seeding questions with historical concepts and questions, using guided reading and winnowing of the results to a narrower and narrower scale through an iterative process that might look like this wackadoodle flowchart of my lab's early process of working with one question. I don't necessarily, the processes of critical search can be combined and iterated in any order. You don't necessarily have to follow our bizarro flowcharts, but the point is that iteration through these steps gives the analyst ample opportunity for engaging critical thinking and engaging the relevant historiography and concepts from their field of study. Okay, so thank you so much. Questions? Mark.
Thank you so much, Joe. I think what I think is so valuable about the talk you just gave was because we're all sort of in the situation where we're trying to blend forms of knowledge which are not familiar to the people that we're talking to, with forms of knowledge that are, and figuring out the line there is so important. And I had a particular question about the way you're presenting word embeddings, which is a complicated model. So, for example, in the chart that you've given us, and the question, sorry, let me frame the question. The question is, I'm asking really, how much information should we present? How much information is necessary versus how much? Right. So you've given me the list of closest words. I assume these are based on a cosine similarity. Okay. But you haven't given me the numbers. You've given me a rank. Right. So to me, it looks like the third most associated word in 1970 was ecology, but in 1975 it's outdoorsman, and in 1980 it's lobbyist, and that's meaningful to me. But I don't know if ecology is like 0.7 and outdoorsman is 0.7 and lobbyist is 0.4, and that would tell me something really, really different than knowing, but that would tell me that because I'm used to like looking at word embeddings and I like to think about this question. So how do you decide the advantages of presenting like a chart that's half numbers to a group of people that don't necessarily know how to read numbers versus being able to present enough information that people who do know how to read the numbers involved in it will be able to glean like additional information. How do you decide, how much is enough or how much is too much?
Thank you so much for that question. The answer is, I decide based on time. If we could keep you here all afternoon, I would do what I do in the undergraduate classroom, and I would show you that, which is exactly the same chart with the numbers. Now, reading this chart correctly takes a little bit more engagement with the math, because what Mark was leading us through is an understanding of y-axis, which is not word count. Definitely not word count. It's an abstract mathematical measure of how frequently, how closely related the word logger is to environmentalist for that time period. So you can have a higher number is very closely associated, a lower number is less closely associated. And again, this is just a sample of the top 10. There are many, many more hits down there. This is also complicated for other reasons that Mark might grill me about if we had lots of time, like, are these aligned with each other? Not on this version, but I have other versions where they are, because you get one sort of standard of accuracy out of the non-aligned version, in that you get very accurate results from each period. So I can speak with authority about what happened in 1970 to 1974. But I get a less accurate perception of change over time, for which I would need the word embeddings aligned with each other. So I iterate, I make multiple visualizations. And in the long form version of all of these exercises, I show all of the work. But when I have a shorter introduction talk like this one, before laying them down, in order to tell a story that presents the work of iteration and what might be obscured. Not everything that's obscured. I already told you in the introduction that every visualization obscures and chops off lots of information and lots of context. But we're skilled readers. We have an appreciation for that. So thank you for bringing in some more of the complication and helping to educate us all about the complications of word embeddings. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you so much. I'll balance this with a non-numbers person question. And I just want to say three things. First, I would like to just offer my appreciation in your articles, in your talk, for the clarity and accessibility with which you talk about methods. It's been so helpful for me as a non-native DH speaker.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. That's so good to hear.
Secondly, I want to know when the text mining book will be out.
Hooray. Hopefully soon. It's out of copy edit.
Very soon. Okay,
Yeah.
Great. That's great. And then this is the substantive historical. Most of the examples you give from your work have to do with parliamentary debates, have to do with land and the questions that you've been studying. Have you taken your method to dabble in some other questions for friends, colleagues?
Yes.
And the one I would love to see is with those debates to take women, children, and animals. Yeah. Just thinking about, first comes the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, later to children, later you're concerned about domestic violence in the home. And it would be a wonderful social history and gendered way of asking, does it come up and go down? Does something last? Does it not? Just so I hand you that question.
Oh, I love that. So what I love about questions like this is that one of the secrets about digital humanities that we always really want to spring on you, everyone who comes to our talk, is that, getting this working the first time took a long time, but getting you, the women, children, and animals, would literally take me 10 minutes.
Exactly. So have fun.
And leave me your email address and I'll send it to you. So, have I done this? Have I done these collaborations? Yeah, yes, I'm working with a group of political historians who are super interested in concepts of citizenship and democracy. They want to know. They have a 13-nation database of parliamentary debates, not just Britain, but also France, Germany, Italy, Spain, the Nordic countries, and the Baltic. Some of them over 300 years, some of them since the 1990s. And through that, they're trying to do a comparative study of the language of democracy. Is it a representative democracy or a participatory democracy? What's the language of citizenship? What sorts of citizens? What are the words associated with the good citizen or the dangerous citizen? What are we debating when we debate the vote? a lot of my work has been trying to do this sort of overview of the shape of time. So what's the periodization of British politics? I've just submitted an article with an American historian, Peter Castor, to the Journal of American History, where we're doing Congress since 1870. What are the turning points that emerge from distant reading? And it's not the ones that are in the US history textbook. So, so interlocutors are always very valuable. Questions like this one are extremely invaluable because actually I don't have to do that much work because you know all of it. So it's yes.
So one other thing I want you to know, before reading your critical search and seeing that diagram earlier, we had named the search tool I'm working at on Winnow. And so I cite your work as C also.
Love it. I love it. That's great. Thank you. Hey.
Okay, I got no, it's a quick question. I was just thinking exactly what happens when you present and there are people who are very familiar with numbers, with methods or not, and in such a generous way you are presenting and inviting people in. But then another statistic that you mentioned, that it seems to be in the background, you know, like you said, actually 90% plus the 90% of the mentions of these environmentalist words go back to just 6 speakers.
Yes.
Now, which is extraordinary to think. But then immediately I wonder if one then asked you, how extraordinary that is or not, you know, and then do you have that answers easily? Or like, I mean, because I just wonder what happens when people start asking, you know, in a way, in the generosity of opening up to questions,
yes.
You also invite people that ask them, like, what happens if somebody asks that?
Yes.
Or then do you need to be prepared with all this, you know, all the slides to answer all other questions, which that, I think that's a great thing about doing this openly and with numbers and statistics, but then it's through the tips and can be.
But the questions could be infinite. And in the same way, we could have, you know, a real specialist in Disraeli here who wanted to like dive into the data, but like I don't have the data right to hand. We could have a great conversation over drinks all afternoon. But for example, the statistics question, if the question is how unusual is it that any 6 speakers have contributed 90% of any group of 2-word phrases, that's a great question. The person who would formulate that question probably has a background in statistics. All of my knowledge of statistics is secondhand and derived from collaboration. So one of the things that I found in the process of becoming a digital historian, having been trained as a social historian, is that I've come to, you know, when I was a graduate student and I was giving presentations like this, my body was always tense and I was always ready to defend every statement that I made and myself as absolute control of them. But I have 250 million words that I'm showing you a sample of, and I'm not in absolute control of them. I've done enough investigation that I can explain the method and have a high-level conversation about the method, but there are more statistical questions that are outside of my domain. So in such a talk as this, if somebody asked, how unusual is it for these speakers to have contributed this proportion of the 2-word phrases, my next question would be, can you tell me how to measure that? And can we meet later so you can explain it to me? So every conversation becomes an opportunity for a longer extended dialogue, which is actually, you know, I have to say, like, I think it took a while to get to this point. It is a long learning curve. Maybe this isn't something that we can give every graduate student right out of the PhD program, but it's a very lovely place to be as an academic, going from university to university and talking to people, because you always have the opportunity to learn from another field of knowledge.
Thank you very much. This is exciting. As we know, the computer tells but doesn't explain, and we rely on domain knowledge to kind of fill in the gaps and contextualize. So we have this whole tradition of pre-DH history that we can look to and learn from to kind of map things on. So when we get a nice output from the computer, we can say, oh yes, I know why it's like this because I've learned about it from here and here. And if I see something like, oh, I don't know why it's saying this, we have to trust that it is telling us something, even if we don't have the explanation, because it told us things that we did have explanations for, and it's not going to suddenly decide to start lying to us. So I'm curious, what do you do? What's that next step? I know that this takes a ton of work. I've been doing it myself. But it generates all these really interesting questions, like why did the memory of the Gordon riots persist? We didn't expect to see that.
Yes.
We have to trust that the model is telling us the truth, that it did persist, because it told us other things persisted when we know that they did. So what's your next step for something like that, or any other kind of research question that comes out of these models? How do you go about generating an explanation when there wasn't one before?
So I think there are two separate questions there. I think there's one question, which is how you get an explanation. How do you get an explanation out of the data if you don't have a rich historiography tradition? So for the example, if I'm working on 15 years of Reddit and I don't have a robust theory about what happened over the last 15 years, I just have all of the op-eds from the New York Times. And so infinite theories of what could have been important. I think there's also another question embedded in there. But I'm losing track of it now, so maybe I'll just answer that first one. So if I'm working on Reddit over the last 15 years, I think this process of going from distant to close reading back to individual exemplary texts becomes very important, because I can look at the references to the earldom of Mar and very quickly come up with an explanation about the Tamworth Manifesto based on secondary readings. But if there's, for example, I've had students who are working on the sexuality thread in Reddit. And so they're applying this method, gives you a periodization of conversations about transgender identity over the last 15 years, which is totally cool. But like you are not, somebody who's not participating in that community would have a very hard time theorizing what those discontinuities are. But if you are able to identify the exemplary texts and then study them with the care that you would apply to reading John Locke on a history of political thought seminar, you can relatively quickly get to a place of a robust analysis. It's just about spending sufficient time with the text. And the work isn't predominantly computational, because it's about comparing and studying text in these very classical exposition methods. Does that help?
Yeah, so then I think the hidden question that I didn't realize was hidden, but you pointed it out, and that made me think of it. There's the extrinsic version of that same question. So intrinsic for the Gordon riots, you'd look at the mentions, you'd see what they're saying,
Yes.
but that's not going to tell you why they're saying it, or like what the reason is that persistence is going on. So you need to look outside
Yes,
the texts themselves.
yes.
And I guess that just turns into a new
That's right.
research project.
That's right. So your question was where do you go from here? And I would say that my text mining practice has fallen into three categories that are motivated in different ways by the reality of the profession. And one of them is methodological. I've just been presenting to you methodological work. It's understanding the fit of these tools to the questions of the discipline in general. And I do a lot of writing that's just methodological. But it's true, if you look at all of the examples, they're all about property, because I'm still writing about the history of property, and I'm getting towards this book in books from now, where I'm going to do the digital history of property. So I have a research agenda that I'm leveraging my own work to, and I'm collecting those examples. And then the third kind is synthetic. So my long-term conjecture is that these tools are useful for examining the longue durée of history in a way that we cannot effectively do using microhistorical techniques. So they're an important supplement to rigorously asking, what are the change points in the 19th century? What are the change points in the last 200 years in a way that we have not been able to do as a profession, just because of limitations of techniques that have now been removed. So I'm often writing a methodological article at the same time as I'm trying to write a longue durée article. So they can serve, I think, where I go is that I might keep on moving through new algorithms in the search of the perfect methodology, and then translate the fruit back into a history of property. But you might decide that you really want to write the long duration history in greater detail and greater robustness, or you'd like to write the history of women, gender, and animals. So you can go in all of those directions. I'm not going to follow up on the earldom of Mar, but if anybody wants it, I cast off a lot of extra research possibilities. I'm never going to follow up on that one. If you take it, it's yours. So I think that's the way that it works.
Yeah, Margaret, thank you so much for a great talk. And I would like to go back to the distinction that you made at the very beginning between history and memory. So you very clearly say that history is institutional. It's kind of like maybe a cleared version of memory, which is messy, personal, individualist, and etc. And I'm curious how you make a connection between the corpus, between the text that you have, and both of these parts of this dichotomy, and history and memory. Because, for example, in terms of disappearance, if something disappears from a corpus, there's suddenly a term stops showing up in it. Does it mean that it disappeared from memory? Does it mean it disappeared from history? Or maybe it is on everyone's mind because no one is mentioning that, which is actually a very common phenomenon.
Yeah.
Right. So now the
Yeah.
question is, how do we connect the kind of analysis of text with history? What happens around where is the rationale coming from to make this connection between them? It reminds me of a very old book by Jonathan Collins when he critiques all the structuralist paradigm, where he says that all structuralists think about that they can make claims about text and their organization just based on text, but actually we read a lot into text, and this information is not at least easily available from the corpus itself.
Yeah.
So so where does this knowledge come from? And it's now is just the corpus, isn't it always about interpretation? Is it possible to have a robust data mine?
You a graduate student? Could I just say, what a beautifully formulated question? Wasn't that a beautifully formulated question? It's really good. Yeah, sorry, not to make you blush. And it was just, yeah, just like right to the heart of the memory issue, but also to these invoking all of these other issues about the limits of corpus. So, defining the archive, I started off by introducing my data set. One of the things that I really like about the parliamentary debates, I'm not a historian of democracy. I'm not a history of politics, trained as a social cultural historian. But the thing that I've come to love about working with the speeches is that it's indexed speech, it's marked. We know what's inside and what's not. Their speech is delivered in a certain place during certain rituals. And it's index of a certain rising to a certain kind of political interest, which is meaningful for the nation in a way, but it's not culture as a whole. But we have opportunities to compare different indexes of cultural experience. So we could compare these acts of memory and on the floor of Parliament to the newspapers or to the novel corpus, and we would find different reflections of memory. And again, that wouldn't tell us about the unspoken thoughts because we don't have Arthur Danto's ideal chronicler who's sitting around writing down every thought in your head, alas. We could do so much predictive work, but we don't. So history is not a predictive science. Sorry, CS. So these different refractions into memory give us a chance, but give us a chance to apprehend them. But it still raises the question of the Bengal famine that kills in million people is in 1880 is not forgotten by any of the survivors. And yet in the British Empire corpora that I'm describing, the newspapers and novels, we have relatively little access to those voices. So that's one of the reasons why delving into scale is important. These caveats and interpretation are so important. But I think, your question is so well formulated, you could run with it in order to examine these methods even further than I've gone.
We have one last question.
Okay, so thanks for this really fascinating presentation. My question is about sources. So sources which are not more digital and needs to be digitalized. So I see a little risk, I don't know if you share this vision, about the impact that this could have on historical research, because who is deciding which sources have to be digitalized and which kind of sources. Like, for example, you did these amazing jobs with parliamentary debates, which are, let's say, recognized as an important source. But what about other sources which are more, about specific individuals and are not, thought to be that important as, for example, at the European level, at the level of institutional grants that give you the possibility to have these sources digitalized. So would it create a risk for the future historians about like neglecting sources who are not available in this format because you cannot apply directly text mining or other technique on them?
In a world in which we are all digital historians and all working on these methodological issues and not we're all working with original archives, that would be a risk. Fortunately, or unfortunately, there is less than one digital historian per history department in North American history departments right now, so I don't think that's a risk. But the overall question about those archives and what the relationship of those archives to digitalization is a very one to the future of the historical discipline, whatever that ratio, whatever that ratio looks like, and whether you ever think historians could become so irresponsible as to neglect the archives. So actually, a group of us spent all morning talking about this problem. And I was describing my travels in Europe this summer when I was embedded in some European research laboratories. And one of the things that I learned about was that in Finland, the humanities deans of 20 universities have come together with several history professors, and they have been drawing up documents outlining the nation of Finland's priorities for digitalizing archives. And because it's the historians talking to the historians, they're thinking about these issues of equity. So they're thinking, if we're going to digitalize, if we're going to rank the most important archives to digitalize, and it's us talking, maybe it's not, they've already got Parliament and the newspapers, but after that, maybe it's not all of the military generals. Maybe there should be some gender equity and racial equity. Maybe there should be some immigrant voices. Maybe there should be some temporal diversity built in. And that exercise is an institutional exercise, but it's so vital right now. I think that historians begin having these conversations on a big picture at an institutional level within universities, but also across universities about how our funds are going to be spent, because that will determine the shape of access for future generations of historians that might use these resources more intensively.
So our seminar time is up, but these conversations will